Alright, and welcome again. This is part, let's see, 1, 2, 3 now of this mini-series on painting, and particularly focusing on the brushes, custom brushes so far. This is a picture here that actually is also somewhat related, right? Here's another example of some vines that are growing and shrinking in size, evolving. And this particular one, actually, I wanted to talk about where it came from, right? Because the idea is occasionally you'll want to get a starting picture. You could go to Google and search for images. Wikipedia has some great resources. But this one here is pretty nice too, morgfile.com. Not only is it free, but also royalty free. So there's a lot of pictures you can use for professional use there. And it's a really great resource as a starting point. If, for instance, you look for tree bark, and that's where this one came up, there are lots of images with some excellent content, and these are free. There are also some connections here to the other well-known iStock, Getty, Dreamstime, and so on. So you'll find some really great resources here or there, but for some of these you're gonna have to pay a royalty fee, of course, if you use that for professional use. Morgfile is what I would call the poor man's alternative, the starving artist's alternative when you want to experiment and actually use it even for commercial use. So what I did is take this to the next exercise here. What I want to do is create some bits and pieces of trees that are similar to this, right? So we have essentially an outline of a tree that we want to pick up as a custom brush eventually. So and then fill it in with some tree bark, right? So that could be a tree bark that we find on some image. And we may want to actually squeeze it in or morph it into this shape, right? If I only click it, or if I use the regular pattern fill in the fill settings, it's going to do okay, but it's not going to be perfect. Let me go and hide this layer here and just focus on this one. So we have this thing here, and we can fill it in. I hit Q for the pattern fill, and that's going to just replicate this entire fill operation and tile it, right? But if I do a warp fill, clear this, and then hit the Q, then we see it warped into it here, and sort of adjust to the width of the tree trunk down here at the base, much wider, and then it kind of squeezes it up. So if I take this image, for instance, I would load this. This is a stored copy of the image that came from somewhere on the internet, copied into the clipboard, and then stored it. And so at this point, I can simply use this as a brush. And when it's in the brush, this is a very high resolution image, so I probably should make it a little bit smaller while it's in the brush. If I look at it in the brush, store and manage a copy, and I can certainly just make it a little bit smaller here, and that affects how it gets tiled in here as well. All right. So now if I Shift K to clear this, and then Q to fill it, you can see it's a little bit more more narrow, smaller, and fits in there nicely. And then so the other thing that we want to do is, of course, also give it some lighting. There's a couple of ways you could go about that. One would be to actually run it through the ray tracer or the path tracer, which is under the transform puppy ray, whether it's the GPU, the fast version, or the slower version with the CPU. You know, you could use that to position yourself over the tree and find it there, and then perhaps go up a little bit and turn your eye down. And actually we wouldn't need the alpha channel here that we currently have, but you could work with that. There is a light source you can move around and have the shadows cast, even not just the lighting on those bumps, but even the shadows being cast. You can adjust the height of these peaks. This is a version that's also showing the sky as a reflection underneath it. So there's some other side effects we could use here. There's the pre-filter we could increase to 1. and essentially, and also enable the global illumination, perhaps with a dark reddish sunset look. So there's a variety of ways to create sort of the lighting effect we want. I did want to show one. Let's start it from scratch here. So we'll create the outline of a tree, just a stump going into the main part of the fat part of the tree. So let's go with the lasso tool and sort of draw the outline, something like this, right? And we know we'll continue further, maybe with the foliage brushes, or draw some branches and other stuff on that. And maybe this is a dead tree stump that's been cut off. In fact, maybe we want to cut off the top here. So use the Shift key and then the right button to cut off this part. Or if you want to add to it, you can use the left button, again with the Shift key down. So I'm going to go and make it a little bit shorter here. I'm going to show something like this and take all this off. All right, so this is the tree stump that I want to fill in. We can store this selection, that might be handy. Let's go store selection and go and now fill it, right? So when we use the fill tool, there it is. There's also a shortcut here on the fill from the image menu, and the fill is interesting. The paint fill, adjustable fill, these three might be useful in this context. There's a clone fill and a feature removal fill, not so much for this particular task, but these three are useful. But they all suffer one thing, which is that they use the current fill mode, right? So right now I see if you select the fill tool, you'll see in the context bar that there is a fill settings option here. And you can probably find that in other places here too, I would assume. There, fill settings from the view menu, right? So the fill settings will give you a couple of ways. By default, it's a plain color fill. So whatever the primary color is that you see on your toolbar, you can change that to maybe a brownish look, and that's what it will look here as well. So as you use the shortcut fill Q, it will fill it with that. That's not good enough yet, right? So we want to fill it with this image of the brush. We're not going to paint it. I mean, we could do that too. We could paint it right in here or stamp it down or something like that, and get a fairly decent look for that. But it's kind of blocky. I mean, it's lined up the same way. It doesn't look like it's arranged or following the shape of the tree. It's down here those areas should be changing direction, right? And they're not. They just keep going down. So what we want to do is have it adjust or warp into the basic shape of this. And so there's the pattern fill we can use. You can click on this. And by the way, if you don't have a tree bark image to work with, there are some here. Click on patterns and you'll see a few to choose from. There is at least one that I remember that is related to the tree stump. Funny, there aren't that many more, but there's lots of rocks and grass. And near the end, there is one called the stump edge there. So that one could be also a good candidate. If you choose that, you can see what that looks like. And then it's a matter of filling it in here, right? So now this one's a little bit smaller. If you clear this and use the fill tool, again, right now it's filling, but it's not warping, it's not adjusting to that shape. So what you want to do is go to warp. One of those warp options, try them. This one here might be all we need, because this has mostly a vertical layout, a vertical path, and so we want to squeeze it horizontally into the edges of that. That will probably do pretty nice, because then those veins will be lining up and squeezing in at the top where it's more narrow and expanding to the roots near the bottom where it's wider. So let's go clear this and try that. So we have warp, and I hit the Q keyboard shortcut, and there it is. All right, let's go with this brush instead. Now this one right now is not doing any fill because we already have something, and it's not finding much tolerance to override it. So that's something you have to do also, is perhaps set the tolerance high enough that it can override the current one. And occasionally what you'll simply do is, well, is clear it. You know, that's the easiest way to not worry about that tolerance. But the cool thing is that you get a little bit of this expansion at the bottom and squeezing at the top where it's more narrow. So that's a good one. The fill vertical might also occasionally look good. Let's give it just its chance or try. Not so much, but hey, sometimes that's the look you're looking for. And then there is also the warp fill both, which at times will do just the best. So you know, give any of these a try. Now this still looks a bit flat, right? If you clear the selection, it still looks flat, and you may want to add a bit of lighting to it. If you know already in your scene where you're going to use this, where the lighting is mostly coming from. Right now, if you have a lot of tree branches and leaves above it coming later on, you're not going to have a whole lot of lighting hitting it directly. So be careful about that. There's also perhaps more of a diffuse darkening shading that you might need to do closer in the top, whereas the bottom parts with the roots are perhaps still somewhat more exposed by some scattered light, making it just around the branches. So if there's a lot of really dense foliage following up here, this upper part might be a little bit darker. But short of that, just as a way to try things, let's go put that selection mask back in place here. Actually, no, you know, we don't even need that. So let's clear the selection and simply go. Let's store this image. This is a milestone reached. Let's go store this an image copy. Again, this is not a safe copy. This is just in memory. So if your battery runs out, or if your program hits a bug and crashes, you're gonna have to redo that. So be sure to save it on a file, or at least in a clipboard or some other place. Copy paste it into Irfan View, for instance. So you have it in another place. It will, if it crashes, it will have this image, but it won't have everything. You won't have the stored copies here. So what we want to do is add a bit of lighting, and one place you can go with one of the filters here, which you can find both in PD Artist and also in PD Howler. And what you'll see with this lighting tool is, let's see, it's under Stylize, right? Lighting tool. And what that does is it puts a light source there, or lets you move that around, perhaps make it up farther, a little bit closer, a little bit less intense. I mean, you can adjust that to really high value. And then let's say you want the lighting to come in from the right side, morning, sunrise, eastern lighting. Make it a little bit closer, and then there, bring it something like this. Now there's also another thing you need, and that's the texture height, right? So you adjust how high those textures are expected, the grooves, the depths of the grooves there, and then multiply it by the original. That one I like a lot. So you do this. Then you can also say, well, there's too much noise, too much fine detail there. Let's use the smoothness and get rid of some of that. So with that, you can create a very simplified look. Right, this is actually a nice tool to remember also if you want to do something that's a bit cartoony looking, right? Almost a cartoony filter. And then you're getting there, right? You have a nice little shading effect there, or lighting effect. You could go the distance up higher, bring it up brighter, all sorts of different ways to make this work. And you could even work with some specular highlight there. That makes it a bit more wet looking. And then there's another thing too, which is the color of the light source, right? Keep that in mind. If you're going to be in a scene, if this is going to be in a scene with a lot of let's say sunset reddish tint or skies, you want to add a light source, or you want to even move the set the color of that light source accordingly, right? So for instance, you might want to have a light source hitting it over there, but then set the color for it to be very deep red, and you get that reddish tint over here, right? This is going to be on two different layers. Keep that in mind. See on the right side here, every time you add a light source, it's another layer, and that's going to be in additive mode, and you can adjust the intensity of that. So let's say we go and make this one an even deeper bluish tint, something like this. Oh, maybe like that. So we have this bluish coloration coming from the left side, and again we can still also adjust how bright that thing is there. So we have now several lights hitting it, and one of them is maybe too bright, so we can go to this layer or this one, and this one actually is disabled. We don't use this one anymore. Yeah, so we can delete this one. Let's go delete this layer. So we have this one, and this one. So this one here, the blue light, a little bit too intense. Let's go and change the amount of opacity on that layer. All right, and then you see it reveals. It still has a bit of a blue there, but it also reveals that red a little bit more. And then the white one here. Well, that one's pretty intense. That's good. The red one, maybe we need to adjust that one a little bit. Let's go and give that one a little bit less dominance. Actually, I like it pretty strong like that. Let's give it like that. Okay, and then so once you have all of these nicely put together, you can flatten this image, and you have now a single flat image. You can put that selection mask back on it, right? You might even want to tighten it a little bit, depending on how you did some lighting or some embossing or some other effects here. You might need to adjust this a little bit. And I'm not sure what just happened here. I have a color change that just happened. Oh, I must have hit. There you go. I must have hit the my middle button, and it caused it to, yeah, it filled it in or something. That's exactly what it is, which is actually interesting. I might want to use that with the interactive undo to say, you know, somewhere in between, right? I like this, but not too much. I like that. I don't like it too much. I like something in between. Right? The interactive undo might actually be very handy for that. So now I have that thing, and I want to turn this into a brush. I have the selection mask. I might want to make the selection mask a little bit smaller, so shrink it, maybe just by 1 or 2 units, 1 or 2 pixels. So now the selection is nicely tight, and we can just pick it up from the brush into the brush here, use the selected as brush. Or again, if you want to be more selective about exactly how close to the edge the bounding box is going to pick it up, right? Because that's what this is going to do. If I go here, use selected as brush, it's going to find the closest bounding box and pick that up, and then I can see brush, store, and manage copy. It shows you here. It's very tight. It touches the bottom. It touches the right end. It probably touches a pixel that's going all the way to the top here. And if you don't want that, if you want a little bit of margin, just step one, go back one step, and then use the manual pickup tool. This one here, the custom brush selector tool. With that, you get to, and maybe zoom in to be a bit more precise about it. We can probably close this. Don't need this anymore. With that, you can be very selective about what you're actually picking up. All right, so there you go. So we have, for instance, look at here, that's the upper area. This is the left side. There's one here at the bottom, about the same level as this, but I think this one is a little bit lower. And then here the right edge. So you're gonna go close with those, but not exactly on it. If you want a little bit margin, give yourself some room, click and drag and hold, and then go something similar here with a few units of margin around it. Pick that up, and now you have a new brush that looks very much similar to the one we just did earlier, except that it has a little bit more margin around it, right? And that's a brush I want to store. Let's go to browse for media. Here's KBs, here's PS, and I don't want to change its name. I just want to select it. And so here I go, and I'm going to go save media, and this is going to be tree stump. And there's probably going to be a few of those. So this is 0, 1. All right, and so we can always pick this and start painting with it, and that's the idea. Now we can go and clear this. We can go and clear the selection. Clear the selection. We can get rid of those trees, stored everything, and anytime we need it, we go back here, tree stump, ready to go. Open the brush. Select the brush tool, open the brush preview or the viewing it, set the opacity for it. All right. There it is. And then, of course, set the size. So we may want to go back to storing this brush, right? Or set the size here. We can resample it right here. And also, as you remember, we can add a drop shadow. We can add that straight to the brush. Or we can enable the drop shadow as a post effect. But so here's what I'm going to do with that is paint with that, right? Of course, I'm going to have a couple of tree stumps like this. I want them to be a little bit different, one from each other. So one thing we want to do is perhaps give it some random somethings: random size, random hue, random saturation, random color, brightness, whatnot. So if you look under the settings for the brush, make sure you pin this down. There is a couple of random pause, random position, random size. Those are not the ones I'm talking about. Well, actually, random size possibly, yes. Right? So they're not all appearing at the same size. This is actually not enough to make it really show different. Oh, and I need to allow brush transform. That's not automatic for a large image. So we want to go to the custom side and say allow brush transform. So now they are coming at different sizes. It may look like a little bit slower because it takes the extra time to resize it on the fly. But there's more we want to that. We do want to also change the hue. So go back to the main tab here in the brush settings, and in the main tab you see some random hue. You can make it a little bit different from one to the next. So one is a little bit more reddish. It's very subtle. It's very almost invisible unless you go a little bit high. There you go. There are some that are a little bit more on the yellowish side and some perhaps more bluish or greenish. There's a random saturation also. So some of them will be highly saturated and others a little bit less. I'm over exaggerating here. I'm doing this a little bit too strong just so it's easier to recognize what's happening. There's a random value, right? Some of them dark, some of them bright. So if you don't do too much of the hue changes, and you don't do too much of the saturation, but you do have some darker ones and some brighter ones, that alone will make it look like a bit more of a nice mix of alternating trees. And so one thing we'll do also is store that. Let's go store that particular one. So we can also quite easily change the size of it. Right, here we go. The ones that are far away, we'll make them really small. There you go. And maybe the distance needs to be a bit bigger. Let's do the step. Something like this. Right? So here we go, even more. Let's see the step. Something like that. We want some random position to that so it doesn't follow your path too well. That sometimes is what you want, but in this case I want some random position so it kind of goes off a little bit more. It looks a bit more natural. Right? Perhaps even more than that, random position all the way like that. There you go. And so if you do a scene where you have some trees like this that are far away and then you want them bigger, it's really easy to now go to that stored copy here and simply say, oh yeah, let's make him a little bit bigger now. Not that big, something like this, right? And then have just a few more that are really close up here. Right, that immediately gives you that perspective feeling of things that are up close and you can almost touch them, and then there's a few more further back there. But you can also do this automatically, and we saw that you can resize the brush along a brush stroke, right? That's another thing that we saw, and we can do that here too. If you draw a brush stroke going from here nearby to the back, but you want it to actually resize and change the size, maybe from back there coming closer, you don't want them to get smaller, you want them to get bigger. What you could do is you could enable that same parameter we saw earlier, the post correction. Again, that's a new feature in version 10, and you could say that they start big and go smaller over time. So big is nearby, and then over there it gets smaller, and you see how it, when you enable that, don't forget, when you enable it, it will resize as it goes to the far distance, right? And then the other thing, you could also go in the opposite direction. You could say, let's start small if you actually paint from far away, because you want the ones that are closer to cover them, to hide them as they write over. So that would be probably the way to do it, from far away, come closer, and so that way, maybe even a little bit faster on the bigger side. There you go. So, right, so now you have some tree stumps that are all lined up. but also changing in size and giving you that perspective feel a little bit here. The random size I have here might be a little bit too much disruption, so let's go like this. All right, now if you're doing this kind of perspective appearance, if you want to have these three sizes convey a feeling of depth by perspective change in size, there is another way, other than the post correction, is to do it on the fly as you're moving back and forth. Right, so let me go disable that, and so that's the final step that I want to show, and that's to create by creating a gradient that indicates how much scaling to apply. So that gradient is something really simple. I mean, you could do this gradient fill tool here, linear gradient, or let's do a circular gradient, why not? And say something like this here. Right? Actually, I'll do the inversion of that, so let's invert this picture. Let's go from black to white, from white nearby to black far away. Right? And I'm going to copy that into the swap image. Let's go copy to the swap, because in the swap image is where it needs to be if we want to use that as a scaling gradient. I can clear the main image. We're still on the main image right up here, but the swap image has it. If we merge both, if we show both together, if you do the layer mixing, you can see that the swap image is there. All right, so that swap image is going to act as a scaler, as a controller for scaling for the size, if we let it, if we allow it. And that's done at the bottom here under the grids, where you have all sorts of artistic helpers. There's the rulers, there's the drawing grid and visible grid, sort of a reference grid you might use occasionally, just as a place to follow or to draw things against, and the drawing grid will snap to it. But there is also the artist guides, and most importantly, there is also this one, the Z-scale guide. So it acts as a guide to scale as if it was a distance Z. And so as you paint now, go back to the brush, and you see the brush here. As you hover over, it's going to change the size. Based on what? Well, based on exactly this image here, right? So you can see the tree stump is big here. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Tree stump is big, biggest at the white part where it's the brightest, and then it goes down to 0 scale here. So that's an automatic scaling, and that is what you can easily use to just paint, and doesn't need the post or the what do we call it here, the post correction. It just scales it on the fly. And so that's a great way to create sort of a perspective appearance, or something else. I mean, it doesn't have to be perspective. It could be a change in size based on other parameters. That thing doesn't have to be seen. You can actually, let's say, set the scale a little bit bigger for the really big ones nearby. There you go. And then far away, that'd be like this. Make sure the step distance is perhaps a little bit higher still, something like that. And so now you can paint away. And there's a couple that will be big, and there are a few that will be small. Oh, come on, not that big, or not that small either. Okay, so now be careful when you go small. They can go really a lot of those. The step distance is crucial. The relative part of the step distance might be interesting too. If you don't have it in relative mode, that step distance is fixed regardless of the size. So you have some big ones that are close together, perhaps too close. You have some small ones that are perhaps should be closer together, and they're not. So that's one of the disadvantages of drawing in relative mode, not in non-relative mode, is that when they are getting big, you would expect them to be a little bit farther apart from each other. All right, let's do another gradient. Let's do a gradient that's actually a linear gradient. So I'm going to go something like this. Oops, that's not the linear gradient. Let's go to linear gradient and go from the horizon to the front. Here, something like that. Okay, switch back to the main image. So we have it now in the swap image, and go back to the brush. And as you see now, the tree stumps here in the back, they're going to be really small. Now, sometimes you don't want them that small. And that's easily fixed. You just adjust it so it's not totally black here. Right, let's say you do erase and then interactive undo to say, okay, let's not have it all the way black, but a little bit gray would be nice. So it keeps a minimum size, maybe 30% or so. And so then you can switch back to the main image. So now you see that the trees will stop shrinking at some level once it reaches the horizon here. Because maybe this is a bunch of trees that are on a nearby hill, and at the peak of the hill, that's it. It doesn't go any smaller. We don't see any more trees beyond that in the sky. So anyway, so here we have this thing, but you have to be careful not to draw beyond that either. So maybe we need to have a selection mask here or something else that's protecting it. But usually you work with something as a reference underneath it in another layer, and you want to have that scaling done automatically. All right, I think we have pretty much all I wanted to cover in this tutorial, giving you some more ideas. Let's see, a random size, not too much. A random position, yes please. Let's see what else. Random saturation, random value, a little bit more. And I think that's really where it's at. Let's keep it relative size this time. So we have, if we draw from far away, small ones, or not. Oh, that's odd. Okay. Maybe I have a selection and I need to clear here. There you go. So I have, just a very high step distance in relative mode now, so it's gonna be perhaps too big. So I need to set that step just a little bit smaller. That was just too much here. So let's give it something like this, because it just didn't have enough room to to grow and to show me a. Okay, so here we go. Still too much. And also I obviously exaggerated this random value thing. There's some that are way too dark now, so I probably should keep the step distance a little bit lower, something like this. There you go. Now I get my tree, my forest, so I can go sideways, and as I'm painting gradually to the front, they get bigger thanks to that gradient. Alright, that's the technique to explore and use, and we will take this further with creating more realistic trees, adding the branches, adding the foliage, and growing some fern into that, and just take it to another level. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.